My spouse and child abandoned me during my illness. Years later, they returned with the intention of taking control of my home. But let me start from the very beginning. It all began with a shocking diagnosis of advanced Hodgkin's lymphoma. Given my active lifestyle, balanced diet, and regular checkups, this news was unexpected. The oncologist explained that the exact causes of my cancer were still unknown. Despite the slim odds of survival, I was resolute in my determination to battle the illness through intensive treatment. Once I received my diagnosis, I sat down with my wife of 15 years, Daisy, and our teenage daughter, Luna, to share the news. Naturally, they were heartbroken, but I assured them I would do everything in my power to fight this disease. However, I couldn't shake off my concerns about how this situation might alter our family dynamics. The doctor had warned me that chemotherapy could be grueling, and many marriages struggle to survive through such challenges. Later that evening, I voiced my worries to my wife. She reassured me that she would support me through this tough time and do everything she could to help. We were in a stable financial situation thanks to my comprehensive insurance, significant savings, and a trust fund left by my late grandfather. Our home was fully paid off, and I had even set aside funds for Luna's college education should anything happen to me. A week later, I began chemotherapy, and it was extremely exhausting. I came home feeling completely drained, as though I had been struck by a freight train. I struggled to even prepare food for myself, let alone complete basic tasks like bathing or walking. My wife and daughter rose to the occasion, taking charge of meals, household chores, driving me to chemotherapy sessions, and making sure my prescriptions were filled. I tried not to impose too much on them and contributed as much as I could when I felt up to it. This routine continued for 2 challenging months. However, I began to sense growing irritation from my wife and daughter. They seemed increasingly hesitant whenever I asked for help. Even my daughter stopped responding when I asked for something as simple as a glass of water or help getting some fresh air. The situation came to a head one day when I had an early chemotherapy appointment. Realizing I was running late, I noticed my wife hadn't yet come down from our room. When I called to check on her, she sleepily suggested I take an Uber to the hospital since she was too tired. I was taken aback by her reaction, but without other options, I requested an Uber and also reached out to the hospital for assistance since my wife wouldn't be accompanying me. Fortunately, my Uber driver was incredibly thoughtful and made sure I arrived safely at the hospital. She even offered to drive me back home after my treatment. I appreciated her kindness, but it was disheartening to depend on the generosity of strangers. When I returned home later that day, things had taken a distressing turn. After resting for a few hours, I gathered the courage to confront my wife and daughter about their recent attitudes. I had sensed a noticeable coldness in their behavior, which was becoming increasingly hard to overlook. I asked them directly if they felt I had become a burden. With a deep sigh, my wife admitted they were feeling overwhelmed. My daughter timidly confessed she hadn't anticipated how needy I would be during my illness. Realizing it was time to explore solutions, I proposed hiring a nurse to come in a few days a week to assist me with daily tasks and accompany me to chemotherapy sessions. Foreseeing days when I might be too weak to walk or even speak, I arranged for a wheelchair. To my relief, they agreed to this plan. I reached out to the hospital for nurse recommendations, and they sent someone who was both kind and firm. She ensured I never missed a chemotherapy appointment, received my medication on schedule, and even developed a detailed care plan that included nutritious meals. Things seemed to be getting better, and the doctors were pleased with my progress. However, despite my attempts to alleviate their load, my wife and daughter still appeared dissatisfied. My wife, in particular, began to feel as though the nurse was stepping into her role. I suggested that if she was willing to take on the duties of transporting me to chemotherapy, managing prescriptions, and ensuring I ate and took my medication, we could do away with the nurse. I had only hired her because my condition had become too overwhelming for my wife to manage alone. She reluctantly accepted this compromise. She requested we find a male nurse instead, but I explained there were no recommendations for male nurses from the hospital. The nurse we had was selected for her expertise with cancer patients and her understanding of my specific needs. She was thorough, attentive, and treated both my wife and daughter with great respect. I made it clear that the only way we could replace the nurse was if my wife and daughter were ready to take on her responsibilities. My wife reacted negatively to this suggestion, firing back that I should take more responsibility for myself instead of making my condition a burden for everyone else. I attempted to reason with her, explaining that there were days when I could barely lift my head, let alone get out of bed. The chemotherapy had taken a significant toll on my body. In a fit of anger, she stormed upstairs, slamming doors behind her. I decided to ignore her outburst, recognizing that her negativity would only impede my recovery. My primary focus remained on my health and well-being. Later that evening, I received a call from my mother-in-law, who lived 2 states away. She expressed her discontent about me bringing another woman into her daughter's home. Technically, the house was in my name, as I had owned it prior to our marriage, but I chose to take the high road. I calmly explained that I needed assistance, and the level of help I required surpassed what her daughter was willing to provide. Consequently, I had to hire a nurse to lessen the burden on my family. I stressed that the nurse's involvement would only be temporary, lasting throughout the remainder of my chemotherapy, assuming the cancer didn't persist or worsen. She didn't seem entirely convinced but eventually dropped the subject, which was all I wanted. For about a week following that conversation, things appeared to return to normal. My treatment progressed without issue. Then, on one fateful day, after returning home from a chemotherapy session, I was taken aback to see a moving truck parked outside my house. My wife and daughter had packed all their belongings and informed me they would be staying at my mother-in-law's home. I was deeply hurt and upset, but my exhaustion prevented me from articulating my feelings. The timing of my wife's departure right after my chemotherapy sessions, knowing I'd be utterly spent and unable to express myself, felt particularly cruel. In search of clarity, I turned to my daughter and asked if this was genuinely what she wanted. After all, she was old enough to make her own choices. Her response hit me hard. She expressed a preference to live with her mother because she found it too challenging to stay with me. It was a painful moment, tears welling up in my eyes as I watched them leave. This was precisely what I had feared when I began my chemotherapy journey, feeling unwanted and abandoned. Amidst my emotional turmoil, my brother stepped in with a solution. He noticed the nurse spending additional time with me that day and asked if I had any family nearby who could offer support. My brother lived 3 hours away and had 2 young children, but he generously offered to take time off work to stay with me until I could find a more permanent arrangement. When he arrived, he was furious about what my wife had done, calling her selfish and ungrateful. He pointed out that she had never had to work during our marriage and that I had always ensured she wanted for nothing. Although my brother's time off was limited to a week, he had another idea. His wife's sister, Kara, was going through a difficult divorce and needed a safe place to stay temporarily. Her soon-to-be ex-husband had been the primary breadwinner, leaving her with limited financial resources. Kara was also studying radiology at a nearby university on a scholarship. My home was conveniently closer to the university campus, making it an ideal solution. This arrangement would ensure I had someone in the house for emergencies, while she would have a refuge from her tumultuous situation. I agreed to the plan, assuring my brother that Kara wouldn't have to pay rent since she would already be putting up with me. She could choose whichever bedroom she preferred. I didn't mind, as my wife and daughter had taken almost everything, leaving only a bed and a few dresses behind. My brother stayed for the rest of the week, and Kara arrived on his last day. He helped her move in, and she expressed her gratitude for allowing her to stay with me. Kara promised to be considerate, clean up after herself, and help where she could. She was genuinely kind-hearted. I explained to her that she wouldn't have to do too much since my nurse would now be coming in 7 days a week instead of just 4. I said goodbye to my brother and did my best to help Kara settle in. In the weeks that followed, things went relatively smoothly. I missed my wife and daughter, but it seemed I was the only one feeling that way, as they didn't even bother to call or check in on me. Kara's presence turned out to be a tremendous help. She took care of grocery shopping, managed most of the cleaning, and even helped with meal preparation. Throughout this time, she never once complained. About a month and a half after my wife's departure, I received the remarkable news that I was cancer-free, a momentous occasion celebrated by ringing the bell at the hospital. My nurse inquired about my next steps now that I was essentially free of cancer. My immediate choice was to file for a unilateral divorce, liberating myself from a marriage that had proven unsupportive throughout my challenging journey. With the divorce process underway, I shifted my focus to the critical task of recovering from cancer, which was a journey in itself. Gradually, I began to regain my strength. My hair grew back, my scars began to heal, and I started gaining weight. I adhered to my healthy meal plan most of the time, but I allowed myself some cheat days to indulge in the favorite foods I had missed during my illness. It's been 6 months since I was declared cancer-free, and I finally feel ready to move forward with my life. I reached out to my former employer, and they're willing to rehire me for remote work if I decide to return. I think I will take them up on the offer, as I plan to relocate. While I have a sentimental attachment to my house, it holds too many painful memories. I long for a fresh start in a smaller place. My wife is unaware, but I plan to give the house to Kara. She stood by me when I was at my lowest, demonstrating immense kindness even though we were practically strangers. She can sell it if she wants. I have no desire to keep it, especially if it means my wife or daughter might claim it. My new home is in a quiet countryside neighborhood, and I'm eagerly anticipating this new chapter. Update number 1. Hello, wife and daughter. It's been over a year since my initial diagnosis, and I've settled into my new place and neighborhood quite well. There are many friendly people around, and I've made friends with my neighbors, including Sophia, who lives across the street. She's a widow living alone, with her children scattered across the country, only visiting during Christmas and her birthday. Sophia invited me to her porch for drinks and conversation, where she shared the heartbreaking story of losing her husband to lung cancer. She emphasized the importance of life insurance for her family's financial security. During our chat, I opened up about what had transpired with my wife and daughter. Surprisingly, I still hadn't heard from them, but I've come to terms with that. I've been dedicating my time to new hobbies, particularly woodworking, and I'm starting to build a collection of tools. One day, when I returned from the hardware store, Sophia informed me that she had noticed some unfamiliar people loitering around my house. Fortunately, they didn't cause any harm or steal anything, but they knocked on the door a few times, wandered around the property, and eventually waited in their car. Sophia considered calling the sheriff's office but chose not to, thinking they might be family. When I asked her to describe them, her description matched that of my wife and daughter.
I was baffled about how they had discovered my new address, as only my brother and his wife knew where I lived. I began to wonder why they were looking for me after leaving without a word almost a year ago. Sophia assured me that if they returned, I shouldn't go outside, and she would handle the situation. Frankly, I had no desire to interact with them after they abandoned me during my most challenging time. Later that evening, I called my brother, who informed me that my wife and daughter had been bothering Kara and her roommate at my old home. Fortunately, Kara had documented proof that the house was now in her name and had explained that she had purchased it from me, a smart move on her part. I felt bad that Kara had to endure this ordeal because of my family, so I reached out to her directly to apologize. I hope that the next time they come around, I can settle the matter once and for all. As for my wife, I'm not sure if she's aware of the unilateral divorce. My lawyer sent a copy to her mother's house, but it's possible they dismissed it as junk mail. Regardless, I've reached a point where I no longer care. She and I are finished. Update number 2. My wife and daughter showed up at the house again, but this time it was during the day while I was working. When I heard the knock, I decided to check the security cameras, and indeed, it was them. My ex-wife looked just as I remembered, but Luna had changed significantly. She was practically a young woman now. I followed the plan Sophia and I had discussed, staying inside while moving closer to the door to hear them better. Sophia, ever the good neighbor, approached them and introduced herself. My wife asked if she knew a man named Charlie who used to live there. Sophia sounded just as puzzled as I was and questioned her use of used to. My wife explained that her husband, not ex-husband, had lived in this house before his recent untimely death following an extended hospital stay. My jaw dropped at this revelation because, to my knowledge, there was no record of my death anywhere, especially not at the hospital.
During my treatment, my wife asserted that they were the next of kin, implying that the house rightfully belonged to them. Sophia informed them that a man named Charlie had lived there for a while, but clarified that he was divorced. She mentioned that I had shared with her how my wife had left me and that I had initiated unilateral divorce proceedings. Sophia added that, to her knowledge, I intended to leave all my assets to charity, as I had no other family except my brother. This made her question why two women were rummaging around my house. The conversation fell into an awkward silence until Sophia asked if they had a death certificate or a will. They both responded with a firm no. Sophia explained that with those documents, they could approach the county's records office, and if they were indeed the rightful owners, they could then have the deed transferred to their names. My wife reacted poorly to this suggestion. She lashed out at Sophia, demanding to know who she thought she was, and began shouting that Sophia had no right to interfere in her business. She accused Sophia of being intrusive and told her to mind her own affairs. I felt a wave of embarrassment wash over me. My neighbors had been nothing but kind, and here was my ex-wife making a scene and disturbing their peace. Though part of me wanted to confront her, I chose to adhere to our plan. Sophia, bless her, apologized and explained she was merely trying to be helpful before returning to her home. Shortly after, my ex-wife and daughter left. Once work wrapped up, I went over to Sophia's house to apologize. She brushed it off, saying she found my wife's behavior appalling but also somewhat entertaining. I wished I could share her amusement, but I knew my ex could be volatile when upset. If she returned, I was determined to confront her and demand that she leave me alone. Just yesterday, she came back. I was in my home office when I heard a loud crash. Rushing into the living room, I discovered that my front window had been smashed, and people were outside shouting. Initially, I feared there was a maniac on the loose, and, in a way, I wasn't far from the truth. It was my ex-wife. She had broken my window, and my neighbors were attempting to restrain her. Apparently, she had been causing a disturbance for a while, but I hadn't heard any of it, as I had my noise-canceling headphones on while working. I wouldn't have noticed her even if I hadn't paused the mic for a break. When I stepped outside, two elderly neighbors were doing their best to contain my ex from causing further chaos. Both she and Luna were brandishing baseball bats, having already destroyed a few of my potted plants. I seized my ex by the arm and asked if she had lost her mind. She looked shocked to see me, or, rather, shocked to see me alive. I ordered both her and my daughter to leave my property before I called the police. Unbeknownst to me, my neighbors had already placed the call. She seemed taken aback by my words and questioned why I hadn't reached out after I recovered. She insisted that she and Luna would have returned. I reminded her that when we got married, we made vows to stand by each other in sickness and in health, but she had broken those vows. I wanted nothing to do with her anymore. She was no longer my wife. I pointed out that I had sent the divorce papers months ago and asked her again to leave. Then she brought up our daughter, claiming that Luna was going to college next year and couldn't afford the tuition on her own. I responded, "Your daughter was fine with abandoning me too, and I'm ready to give up all my parental rights to you. You should have thought of that before you left me. I don't want anything to do with either of you." Her demeanor shifted from hurt to fury as she called me selfish and heartless, which I found rather amusing under the circumstances. "You're the last person who should be calling anyone selfish," I shouted back, labeling her an entitled jerk and making it clear I'd ensure she never received a cent from me again. Just then, she swung the bat at me, and fortunately, the cops arrived right on cue. They immediately apprehended both her and my daughter. When the officers asked if I wanted to press charges, my answer was a resounding yes. My ex and daughter began crying as they were escorted to the police car, but I felt no sympathy for them. I had all the events on camera, including my ex-wife smashing the window, and I had submitted the footage to the police. After work, I ordered a new window and cleaned up the glass. A rigged-up tarp was all that kept out the elements for now, and Sophia kindly provided me with some buckets to hold my plants until I could replace the pots. Curious about what had driven my ex-wife to return, I did a bit of digging. I discovered that her mother had passed away 2 months prior, and they had recently learned that the house they had been staying in didn't belong to her or her husband, it belonged to his cousin. The cousin had decided to evict them because he wanted to sell it. With both of my ex-wife's parents gone, she and our daughter had sold most of their belongings and were living in a motel. When they returned to our old home and saw Kara there, they assumed I had died and began snooping around for records of my assets and purchases, which is how they eventually found me. Regardless, they now face charges for vandalism, attempted breaking and entering, and attempted assault. Since Luna is a minor, she's being assigned community service, but my ex-wife is facing jail time. As this was clearly premeditated, I'm considering obtaining a restraining order as well. At least for now, I won't have to worry about her for a good long while.